last month, we had our 7th discussion. So we talked about the 10, maybe 12 commandments of Islam. When I looked back at my teenage notes, I had actually had a little post-it that said the 12 commandments of Islam. So I guess there are different ways to interpret it. But we had an interesting discussion about that. Are there 10 commandments in Islam? Are there more, less? Is it something we even need to focus on? And had a really interesting conversation about that, many different viewpoints. So if you missed it, we encourage you to watch the video. We're going to be sending it out soon. And we also asked the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things happen to bad people? And we also had many different viewpoints on the issue. So thank you for everyone who participated in that. That is the name of the game of what we're doing here. Is we want to hear multiple viewpoints. We want to hear from everyone. So this is not a place where you ever need to say something like, oh, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a this, or I'm not a that. Everyone has something valuable to share from your different perspectives, viewpoints. The Quran is a universal, timeless book for all people, all times. And so we want everyone to participate and not hold back. At the same time, if you have read the Quran before, we invite you to enter this discussion looking at the Quran and the questions we ask and the verses with fresh eyes, and see what you can learn, what you can learn from other people, what new things you can pick up on. And in that way, it'll be a way of expanding everyone's minds, regardless of where they're coming from. First question today is, how has reading the Quran for yourself changed you so far this year? So you could talk about your behavior. Is there anything that has changed in your behavior? Is there anything that has changed maybe within your character, maybe how you feel, how you think, whether it's how you think about Islam or how you think in your daily life, conduct yourself, or maybe even changes that you've made to your environment or how you see the world? All right. Who would like to share first? How has reading the Quran this year for yourself changed you in any way at all?
Hey, Tasneem, I'm really glad to be here. I'm on the East Coast, so I've missed the past couple ones, but I was like, I'm really going because I've been really reading and I've been pretty hardcore with keeping up.
Nice.
And I was telling Hala, we were talking about it, and I know it's so funny, and I've talked about my personal experience too online and in this group, and I feel really comfortable talking about my experience as like a Muslim in recovery and a queer Muslim and this disabled, this and that. And I've just you all of you, and this is for everybody. I've just become so Muslimy, like even more.
Define. How do you define Muslimi? Because we all have a different definition of that.
Honestly, everything, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, everything, mashallah, like, and the way I think about the world, the afterlife, I'm like thinking about the afterlife. I'm like, okay, what's happened? Like, what am I doing? And then I'm thinking about the ways in which the Quran talks about nature and the birds. And, there's a part that we read in the Quran. I should have, Allah shows us that Allah is Allah by the wings of a bird, like how a bird is in how a bird flies, basically. So I spent the whole summer like looking bird watching. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm getting this point of like, uh, it's not about us Muslims, us like, oh, I'm praying this many times a day and doing this, and doing this ritual and saying this dua and doing the. It's really about like my spiritual belief in the Quran and what it dictates how my life, how I'm leading my life. Am I looking at the birds? Am I seeing God in the birds? Or am I like trying to find partners, whatever gender they may be? Do they have the same spiritual life that I have? And is that dictating my commitment to other people? You know, so it's like, yeah, I've just become so Muslim. Anyone else? Has
Beautiful.
anyone else been reading the Quran and becoming super Muslim-y?
I love you and I love that response. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool. I feel so special, and like this is really special, and it's really like the way that it's designed, the way you have it, and the read it and the everything, all the emails and everything, it's designed for spiritual upliftment. So you're,
Alhamdulillah.
yeah, if you can take that as a critique or positive, something like it, if you follow it, I'm not saying anyone who doesn't is not going to get spiritually uplifted. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, yeah, I'm following it and now I'm experiencing that.
Amazing. Alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. And no pressure if it's not working for you. No pressure to match what she says. But yeah,
Yeah.
just a little background on that. Like everything that I've put into the curriculum is something that I've done on myself. So this is all coming from my personal experience, life experience, and every single question in there is a question I've asked myself 1,000 times. And just because Islam to me and is fun, it's my passion, and so it means a lot to me that it is working for you, alhamdulillah. And if it's not working for anyone, please let me know because I do want to improve. But I'm very happy that you're having that experience, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, it gets even better for you. All right. Anyone else? No pressure. You can say that you've had no change whatsoever. No pressure.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Rabia and I was speaking on something very similar, that we found a whole new level of love and appreciation for the Quran that felt like was missing before. Like I've read it before in English, never this translation, but never felt the level of connection that I have in this time around. And I think that is largely due to some of the questions and some of the contemplations that we've had to do through, with the curriculum.
Well, I'll just add what I've really appreciated is the way Muhammad Asad explains his translations. So I love the fact that he will quote different scholars, even those that might have a different interpretation. And then as the reader, I feel like I have the choice when he gives, this scholar said this, another scholar said this, my interpretation is this because of, he'll give his viewpoint. But as a reader, I feel like I'm given a lot of information and I can make the choice whether I agree with his translation or I agree with another perspective. And it's been beautiful. I think the times that I'm with the Quran and just reading, it's become one of my favorite parts of the day.
Amazing. Yes, Muhammad Asad's translation, that's why I'm like, it's like worlds better than all the other translations out there, not to put them down, but that's exactly the beauty in his footnotes, and why it's a required part of our program is because he models how to engage with the Quran and with religion and thinking critically. And he comes from a very humble perspective where he, will be passionate and strong in his own viewpoints, but he'll also acknowledge, people who disagree with him. And that's what we need to have in our culture as Muslims and outside of Islam as well. Inshallah, that's the pluralistic attitude that we can bring back. Awesome.
I would say that as I become more and more familiar with the Quran, and this is not my first time reading it, but I think I become more confident in being able to navigate or discern like what is, what actually is Islam? What does the Quran say versus what have I heard, from this person or that person? And as I feel that as I grow in my own faith and knowledge of the Quran, that I feel more and more comfortable to be myself. And to express myself, within the within the boundaries or guidelines that God gives us in the Quran. But I feel an increasing comfort, actually, to be who I am, and so that's been maybe surprising to me. Yeah.
That's amazing to hear, because that has been, what we've been saying all along is like Islam is the tool of empowerment. But if you look at how we're framed in the media, you would believe the exact opposite, right? So that's amazing that, your connection, deepening your connection to the Quran is empowering you and uplifting you. Great. One of the first things we did in this program in the earlier part of the year was we took a look at the verse of light. So this is the famous verse, and I'm going to read it for you in just a second. Chapter 24, verse 35. And so one of our first activities, I know we discontinued Reddit, but this was before we did that. We asked everyone to, before they start reading the Quran, give their thoughts about what they think the verse of light means, how they interpret it. And now that we've gotten to that part in the Quran, and now that we have maybe a better idea of how God communicates in the Quran, this elliptical, multifaceted, multi-layered way of speaking to us, sometimes metaphor, sometimes literal, sometimes both. Now let's take another look at the same verse and see, is there anything new that we pick up on? How do we interpret it now versus how did we interpret it before? Chapter 24, verse 35. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of God's light is, as it were, that of a niche containing a lamp. The lamp is enclosed in glass, the glass shining like a radiant star, a lamp lit from a blessed tree, an olive tree that is neither of the east nor of the west, the oil whereof is so bright that it would well nigh give light of itself, even though fire had not touched it. Light upon light. God guides unto God's light the one that wills to be guided. And to this end, God propounds parables unto humanity, since God alone has full knowledge of all things.
So I don't know if this was discussed earlier or someone has brought it up, but there's this understanding, a traditional understanding, that God guides whom He wills. Like the agency isn't placed on the people seeking, but that it's through the grace of God that He has chosen you. At least that's been my understanding. So this time, what's coming out to me or at me is who's like the agency is in the people that are seeking or searching. And, God will choose you or God will show you only if you're seeking. So it doesn't just happen that, okay, you've just been given this blessing, but you have to be looking and ready and open to receive.
Awesome. So the first time around, or maybe, before looking at this verse in depth, she had a different understanding of free will, that maybe it was more tipped in the favor of God's bestowing a blessing. And now through this verse, she's seeing a little bit more agency of, it's not us who is in control, but it is us who has the ability to be open to God gifting us guidance.
On that point with regards to agency, I did notice how Muhammad Asad translates, God guides unto his light him that wills to be guided. And I appreciate that, because the Arabic can be ambiguous. So that could mean either God guides to his light whom God wills, or whom wishes to be guided. So both of those are options. And then he has a point about that being so and preferring Zamakhshari's. So it's cool to have that perspective because we don't often translate verses like that.
First of all, it's just an incredibly beautiful, beautiful verse. And one of the things that I don't think I stood out to me as much before was it's something that we've talked about in these series, but how much God uses imagery and like things from this world, like the niche and the lamp and the oil and the olive trees and our understanding of direction, like how much he uses things that we are familiar with to tell us about something that is something mystical, something that is beyond our capacity to comprehend. So that's something that's striking me this time.
God speaking to us in our own language, even not just literal language, but our visual language and our experiential language. Yeah.
Yeah, and reflecting on this verse again, I'm struck by the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen to describe Allah's self as. And it's all, to me, like life-giving things. Like light is life, like the sun is life, and trees are a life-giving force on earth. And so I think that's something that that hadn't struck me before. I think this time I'm like, wow, this is really how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to connect us to Allah as being the source of all life-giving things and the source of the originality of life itself.
Yeah, so much already. Just one verse. There's so many layers. It's amazing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think this verse is really beautiful, but the conversation has brought something else up for me, which is just kind of translation and linguistics. And I've been finding just kind of the explained meanings behind word choices really interesting in the footnotes, like the fact that God refers to himself as I and we, and the explanation for why that would change, because it's a little bit behind, beyond our understanding. So there's different ways of that being referred to. But then to your point, when you said in the Fusha, maybe it could be translated one of two ways, but then the chosen way was this way. It makes me wonder how often that choice is being made by the translator of, I'm going to interpret it this way, but it could be this. And so that's always the pain of translation, right? There was one phrase that I read a while back that was, the phrase was like, and my subtle scheme. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, I wonder if the creator of worlds says things like, my subtle scheme, and I found that kind of like quirky and kind of cute. And I was like, is that just translation? Or is that like the echoing voice of God saying, I have a subtle scheme? And so to me, the linguistics of it is very interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's crazy how just with a single word, the whole meaning can change to a whole different individual, right? There's so many ways that we as individuals can interpret the same thing. So yeah, that is exactly why we need to always hear from multiple perspectives, because then we can get to the bottom of maybe not defining, but at least opening our minds to other possibilities. Awesome. Anyone else before we move on to an interesting question? One last one. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to just reflect on like not only this verse but also the context of this chapter, where it's so allegorical, and it's like in the midst of this chapter Nur, which starts off as a lot of like legal matters and then ends off with some legal matters, and it's just want to point out that like structure, that suddenly there's this like rich juicy allegorical chord to this this chapter that's quite beautiful, because it's not only this verse but also verses on like the birds in flight making tasbih and prayer, and God creating all living creatures out of like water, crawling and walking, and so much of that imagery interwoven in this structure at the heart of this chapter.
Did anyone pick up on or come to the conclusion that it could be a reference to electricity or a description of electricity? Nobody? Man, when I was younger, when I read this verse for the first time, I was like, it's talking about a light bulb, a lamp, to people 1,500 years ago. But yeah, I put in a little picture of a light bulb in the curriculum just to satisfy my little self. Okay, great. And yeah, and I'm sure, we heard from how many viewpoints today. I'm sure there's even more that we haven't uncovered yet. Okay, so now here is me having a little fun. So obviously, we know that Muslims also believe in resurrection of Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. So here is the question. How do you think Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, will be raised to life again? Metaphorically, through a resurrection of his original message of God's oneness? Spiritually, with his soul placed in a new baby's body? Literally in body, like a zombie or a clone? Something else? Many theories exist and nobody knows. So let's share today. How do you think? And obviously, none of us knows. This is just for fun. But I put out a few, possible possibilities. What do you think? Just from what you've read so far, through the Quran, when God talks about resurrection, when God talks about Jesus, peace be upon him, how do you think that he will be resurrected? So 1915, this is talking about John, the son of Zechariah. Hence, God's peace was upon him on the day he was born, and on the day of his death, and will be upon him on the day when he shall be raised to life again. And then later on, it's talking about going into Jesus, son of Mary, and then finally goes to 1933. This is Jesus talking. Hence, peace was upon me on the day when I was born, and will be upon me on the day of my death, and on the day when I shall be raised to life again. And then the next verse is 1934. Such was, in the words of truth, Jesus, the son of Mary, about whose nature they so deeply disagree. So who would like to go first? And we got all types of perspectives here. I know some people are coming even from a former Christian background, so it'll be great to hear what everyone has to say.
This is not a topic that I've thought much about, because I think it's because when the Quran says that we all will be raised up, I just assumed that it would be the same way and nothing different about it. But now I don't know. I'm curious to hear what other people think.
Well, I know the Orthodox opinion speaks of Jesus' return at the end of the age, and that draws a bit, I believe, from like the Christian tradition, and yet, well, the question I would like raise is like, how much of that is from the Quran itself versus from extraneous traditions that have built up? From the Quran, we have like versus what you said, a parallel structure. We assume that John died, and that John's resurrection again is the resurrection everyone would face. And then again, like that parallel, Jesus was born, Jesus will die, and then the resurrection is the same resurrection we all face. There are other verses of the Quran where where Jesus says, "Falamma tawaffaytani," when you have taken me. And we, like the term wafa in Arabic often refers to death, but it could also mean something else, like passing in a certain way. So there's that ambiguity there. There, like, so that, like, I don't see any clear verses like talking about a return of Jesus in particular, versus all of our collective resurrection, as you mentioned. That's the promise that we are all given of the resurrection of the hereafter. So there is a verse, I don't have it in this section I have of the Quran, but of Surah Zukhruf. Do you have the translation, Surah
Yeah,
Zukhruf?
I can look it up.
So this is Surah 43, 61.
43:61, and behold, this divine writ is indeed a means to know that the last hour is bound to come. Hence, have no doubt whatever about it, but follow me. This alone is the straight way.
Maybe I'm wrong. So there's a verse that that often is brought up to refer to Jesus' return, but if you read it in
Oh,
context,
63, maybe?
61 over.
Here, let me keep reading because it does get to Jesus. So that was 61. Then 62 is, and let not Satan bar you from it, for
Yeah.
verily he is your open foe. Then
So-
63 is, now when Jesus came to his people with all evidence of the truth, he said, I have now come unto you with wisdom, and to make clear unto you some of that on which you are at variance. Hence be conscious of God and pay heed unto me.
One of the things I would raise for discussion is that often verse 61, innahu la ilmun lis-sa'ati fala tamtarunna biha. It's taken, oh, he is a sign of the hour. And so that's often used as a proof for Jesus's return, that Jesus is a sign for the hour. And yet the verse before it was that وَلَوْ نَشَاءُ لَجَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ مَلَائِكَةً فِي الْأَرْضِ يَخْلُفُونَ. And if we wished, we would have made on the earth, or amongst you, like angels on the earth in successions. And then the sign that is mentioned in the next verse may be a reference to those angels being on the earth, which is described in other parts of the Quran. So again, it's like a question as to really, there's ambiguity in the verse. Is it really talking about Jesus or other, and I don't want to bring up controversy.
No,
but
that's
I
the
just
whole
like
point. Let's do it.
part of
That's the
the-
whole. You literally are doing exactly what this discussion circle is designed for. It's awesome. Yeah, and then on that note, let me read. So Muhammad Asad actually translates that same concept as the divine writ. So you're bringing up possibly angels. He says the divine writ. Then the second translation that we most often use or reference is Dr. Lale Bakhtiar, and she says, and truly he, meaning Jesus, is with the knowledge of the hour. So contest not about it and follow me. This is a straight path. And there is, I think, Yusuf Ali says, and in parentheses, Jesus shall be a sign for the coming of the hour of judgment. Wow, that's a lot of words that aren't there. Therefore have now no doubt about the hour, but follow ye me. This is a straight way.
I just had a question, but with that, that's still not related to your question about how he would appear.
Well, I guess, from his perspective, that it's not a special separate appearance. So
But
so
he's the
basically
beginning of it.
Or my point is that, like, the Quran doesn't make that much of a focus on the Armageddon, like, end times. It's talking about, there are parts of the Quran which talk about the judgment at the end, but it doesn't have a focus on those end times as we see in say, the book of Revelation in the Bible. That our focus is on our present lives, what we have to do good, and that we will all die and then we will all be resurrected. And there's no necessarily Jesus' return or even a mention of the Dajjal or any mention of the Mahdi or all of these concepts of this Armageddon-like battle aren't even mentioned in the Quran, which is interesting based on how much we sometimes focus on that.
Okay, cool. So we got one vote for, I wouldn't say not at all, but not a special separate resurrection, just the normal everyday resurrection that all of us will experience.
Yeah, I also vote for that. That
Okay.
everyone just, kind of risen up at the same time into the afterlife. But something really interesting came up in our conversation, and my discussion partner said, well, then there's the 1,000 years of peace. And I was just like, and so I was more interested in that, really, at that point. And I was like, when do we get the 1,000 years of peace? Is that a thing? What are the indicators of that? And is that Quranic? So I wanted to discuss that a little bit.
When we were talking about the resurrection, we discussed a couple of other concepts that maybe we had heard about but not read yet. And one of those was the Mahdi, which I've heard so much about, but I haven't yet read anything in the Quran about it. I am behind in my reading. But also this concept that I've heard about 1,000 years of peace, but I haven't come across it in the Quran yet.
Okay, so let's not spoil anything for anyone. This is a year-long journey, and this is part of this program's process. Is we've all grown up hearing all sorts of things about what Islam is, what it isn't, and in reading the Quran, we're starting to find out, not just because if something's not in the Quran doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but maybe it came from hadith, maybe it came from culture, maybe it came from a sectarian divide, right? So let's keep searching. We have 2 hands raised online. So Alia and then Hala. Go ahead.
I have always thought of it as very literally, as far as the second coming of Jesus alayhi salam. I mean, that's, I think, just from my upbringing, I haven't, as folks have pointed out, actually, that, there's not actually any specifics that we've read so far about this event that we are anticipating. But from my own knowledge of how prophets have been treated, one of the things is that they cannot be killed by man. They have only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can take them from the earth. And so that kind of plays into my understanding of it. And then as far as how the second coming will happen, I also just kind of thought of it as almost like a teleportation. Like, Jesus is in heaven right now with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, waiting for the point in human history where he's meant to come back, and then he will just appear to humanity and then do all the things that are prophesized. Because I also don't believe, or like Islam doesn't speak about reincarnation or like souls taking new bodies, like as other faith traditions sometimes do. And so I mean, we obviously don't really know what Jesus alayhi salam looks like, but whatever his form was in his initial creation is what I imagine that he will come back as, and in an adult form.
Okay, we got one physical resurrection of how he originally was. Hala?
So during our discussion in the breakout, we struggled a little bit because, first of all, one person asked, why was this question relevant? And second, I think we were reflecting, at least I was reflecting on how I don't recall where and in which tradition we're getting this information about the reincarnation of Prophet Jesus. And in my imagination, with whatever information I've absorbed, I believe that he will come in the form that he left. I don't know how that would be possible, but that's what my imagination leads me to believe. Yet, because this question was asked and framed in a way, now I'm leaving questioning myself, where is my information coming from and what am I believing?
Fun. Yeah, this question is purely just for fun. there's no point other than let's see what Muslims think, because I mean, living in a mostly majority Christian country, and even as Muslims living in a political system that sometimes attacks other countries specifically to bring on the coming of Jesus, right? It's just something that we often hear a lot about from a Christian perspective. So I just wanted to know, what do Muslims think? Because again, maybe this is all me just defending my little childhood self. Because I remember once when I was little, I said something about I thought, oh, I think scientists had just started like cloning Dolly and doing all these things, and then they had found like an old cloth with Jesus's blood on it, and I was like, oh, they're gonna clone him, and then everyone laughed at me. So maybe that's where this question's coming from. Okay, we got Alia raising her hand again.
Yeah, I was just going to add actually to that thought about, him not having died. One of the themes that's throughout the Quran, that also kind of plays into this second coming piece, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that all people will die. And we believe that Jesus did not die on the cross. And so he hasn't had his death. And so that has to still happen. He's a human being. And so that's part of my thought process with that. He has to actually come back before the day of judgment because he hasn't actually died.
Yeah, so I think just what Alia was saying, my wheels were turning along the same lines. I think we have a lot of technology, right? We have stem cells, we have all this cloning and all this um, changes, visible, improvements or what have you. But what Alia was saying, I think I was thinking along the same lines, that he, if Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, somehow shifted in a realm of energy, or in another, however he disappeared or was taken, it will not be something out of an ordinary to come back in the material form. Like Alia said, right, we all have to die, and if he hasn't died, then it's not far-fetched to imagine how he can return in XYZ forms. And yeah, it's like energy, right? What you were saying, light bulb, Hasna. So I think if we just stretch our imagination a little bit, we can assume that, we think about forms, right? We think how much our imagination can behold, like what forms can a human take, a body can take. And if, mummies can be preserved for thousands of years, who knows, God, how has God preserved Prophet Jesus's spirit, energy, form? So yeah, it's fascinating if you really keep thinking about it. And like you said, the framing of the question, that's what one of the participants said in the breakout room, that, given that we live in a Christian country, she had a visceral reaction to the question, that why is it
Yeah, I would say
recording things?
Oh, whoa, you went out. Your audio went out. Can you say that again? I
Sorry.
think you weren't finished.
Yeah, basically, like, the question being like, how, and I think the framing, right, what you just stated, that living in a Christian country, having dominant narratives around us, why do we bring this example per se, even though I think it's relevant? Personally, I feel like questioning our sources of information and references and cross-references and cross-checking them, understanding, right? The point that whatever verse even we're bringing or thinking to bring, is it a hadith? Is it, where are we getting those sources of information? So I think this question is very relevant to kind of make us do this mental exercise and see, how much we are pushing our imagination because we have certain beliefs or certain knowledge passed to us, which is making us think in certain directions. So yeah, I mean, just the framing of the question, and also like the dominant narrative versus, the meta narratives and the narrative within a narrative, right? As a outside facing and inward facing community. It's fascinating. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'll answer a little bit of why it definitely is relevant right now with everything going on in, or not right now, but which has been going on in Israel and Palestine. Just for years, decades, as Muslims living in the U.S., we've heard that there is one sect of evangelical Christians who wants to take over Jerusalem and wants to take over Palestine because then Jesus will come. And so that's why it's relevant, because if they're waiting, or if they're causing so much destruction, waiting for a physical form, but if he either is not coming in the way that they imagine or is coming in a different way, will they stop? Will they stop the destruction if they get what they want? And yeah, and it's, none of us knows, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, none of us knows. And even my own viewpoints from childhood to now I kind of think like it's probably going to be more of a resurrection of his message, because I am starting to see, like, almost every day I'm seeing another politician or journalist or someone who was really for the Iraq war. These are the people now who are renouncing their former views, and they were saying, hey, we were wrong about Islam, we were wrong about going to war and all of these things. I think it's relevant in terms of, when there is another group that is waiting for this sign, what if they have it wrong? And if there's a way that we can help them see that, maybe they're waiting for the wrong thing, or maybe the metaphor I always like to give is like, trying to kill your way into getting Jesus to return is like kidnapping all of Santa's reindeer and being like, oh, Santa's gonna come down my chimney to get back his reindeer, but when he comes back down, you're gonna be on the naughty list, so you're not really thinking this through, right? So it's not just the ends, it's also the means. But yeah, I would say it is definitely very relevant in terms of Israel and Palestine today, and some of the forces that are pushing for, with no regard to human life on either side, are doing it for this one cause of trying to get Jesus to return in their personal lifetime. Let's end with this famous verse. So if you've ever been to a Muslim wedding, you've probably heard verse 30:21, so chapter 30:21. But a lot of times people don't say the next verse. And every time I've gone to a Muslim wedding, I'm always like, keep reading the next verse. But they never do. So I'm going to read both verses. And I want to see, does this change your understanding at all of how to interpret the first one? So, and among God's wonders is this: God creates for you mates out of your own kind, so that you might incline towards them. And God engenders love and tenderness between you. In this, behold, there are messages indeed for people who think. And now the next verse that no one ever keeps reading is, and among God's wonders is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your tongues and colors. For in this, behold, there are messages indeed for all who are possessed of innate knowledge. So I think the reason why I always was like, keep reading, because I feel like 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, there was a lot more not discussed. I'm trying to figure out the way to categorize this, but racism in the Muslim community, where people would say, yes, you're my brother, you're my sister, but they wouldn't allow their children to marry each other if they were from a different race. And so that's why I always like, come on guys, keep reading the next verse every wedding I went to. But yeah, I wanted to know, does that change, hearing the context? And it doesn't end there either. Then it goes to talk about the day and the night. But how does reading both of these verses together in terms of thinking about Muslim marriages and love and cultural traditions versus what God says in the Quran, how does this affect your understanding of both verses?
Is this the one? It can also be translated to "We created you of different tribes so that you may know each other." Or that's a separate one?
That's a one that's coming up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, spoiler alert.
Yes.
But I just it's funny that you bring that up because I just had a conversation recently. I go to a mosque that's very predominantly South Asian Muslims, and it's come up a lot recently. Because me and my friends are all of marriageable age, and so during a conversation about marriage, I asked my friend's mother, because another friend had brought up, oh well. I thought you only wanted your daughter to marry another South Asian person. She's like, no, Arab is fine. This is fine. And I said, okay, auntie, is African fine? And she went, oh, no. Yeah, and basically, but she had before that said, oh, any is fine as long as they're a good Muslim. And I said, well, there's African Muslims too. And she just got really uncomfortable, and it just made me realize that it's one of those ways in which Muslims become slaves to their cultures and become slaves to a lot of the human ideas that we try to look, like what lenses we're looking through to be able to understand the world. When in reality, God really gives us those lenses to begin with, right? But our brains are so small, and earlier you talked about this idea of, God using imagery that we're comfortable and familiar with because we have such a lack of understanding of the full picture. But I found it funny that you mentioned that, because I do wish people would keep reading. And in that conversation that I had with that auntie, I mentioned, well, God says we made you of different tribes so you may know each other, and she just didn't really want to hear it.
Now you got more ammunition. Go back with this.
Oh gosh, she's gonna hate me. But so it was one of those things that really made me realize the ways that we're slaves to our cultural backgrounds and those kinds of things.
I really love this verse. I find it very powerful. That here you have the Quran celebrating linguistic and racial diversity amongst humans. And I don't know of any other religious text before then in that context that does so, to celebrate human diversity as a sign of God. And it's significant compared to, say, the Bible, where in the Tower of Babel story, linguistic diversity is taken as a curse of God to break up humanity. It's here we're taught to appreciate it. And there's some things that I want to point out about this verse, which I also find very interesting, is that the whole section has has a repetition. Verses before, Inna fi dhalika la'ayatin liqawmi yatafakkarun. This is a sign for people who think. In the verse after, Inna fi dhalika la'ayatin liqawmi yasma'un, people who hear. Then qawmi yaqilun, people who ponder. This verse, in the context, breaks away from that regular rhyme. Instead, it says, Inna fi dhalika la'ayatin lil alimin. And so the rhyme breaks in this verse. And also, the last word, alimin. Alim is somebody who knows. Alimin are those who are knowledgeable. But this verse can also be recited as alamin, or the worlds. So there's two different readings of this verse based on a single vowel, alimin and alamin. This is a matter of the kira aspect. So the meaning of this verse can differ. And so I find it a beautiful, like a way of reflecting itself, that this verse is celebrating human diversity, and in its context, breaking the structure as like standing out from its verses around it, recited in multiple ways that can have different meanings. So it's like
It's like a meta commentary on it.
Yeah, on the same
Even though
topic.
I hate the word meta. Because
So I do find it very relevant here. And then I also note that in another verse that talks about human diversity.
Is it 49:13?
Well, what verse is that?
Here, the nations and tribes one. I can read it.
Oh no, it's
okay.
Do I have it here?
I'll read that since Natasha just talked about it. Chapter 49, verse 13 says, O humanity, behold, we have created you all out of a male and a female, and have made you into nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another. Verily, the noblest of you in the sight of God is the one who is most deeply conscious of God. Behold, God is all-knowing, all-aware.
The verse I'm referencing is a verse that talks about mountains of different colors, red, black, white, and then animals and humans also of different colors. And then says right after that, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. Those who truly fear God are those who know. So it's using that same aspect of knowledge, like with knowledge that you see in this verse and in the other verse. It ties it to that appreciation of diversity and human diversity. Yeah.
And that verse, it's chapter 35, verse 27. Are thou not aware that God sends down water from the skies, whereby we bring forth fruits of many hues, just as in the mountains there are streaks of white and red of various shades, as well as others raven black. And as there are in men and in crawling beasts and in cattle too, many hues. Of all God's servants, only such as are endowed with innate knowledge stand truly in awe of God, for they alone comprehend that, verily, God is almighty, much forgiving.
And what's interesting about that verse is that in mentioning that, in mentioning different tribes, and in the first verse that you talked about as well, there's no disparities between each type of person, each group of each gender, right? The only thing that maybe is that sets one apart from another is the level of knowledge and level of awareness, you know? And even within that, it's not something is not accessible to a certain race or a certain gender or a certain, background. All things are possible, and knowledge of God is available and should be available to anyone. And it also reminds me of that one verse that refers to both men and women, right? And God bounces back and forth. He says men, men should be learned, women should be learned, men should be pious, women should be pious, and basically just holding everyone accountable the same way. And yeah, so I think it's beautiful that Allah makes it very clear throughout the Quran that there is no real way that people can justify being better than anyone else on any other basis than how aware they are of God and how willing they are to share that information.
And one more, so when God is talking to the bee and is talking about the healing aspect of the honey, is actually, again, celebrating diversity. So this is chapter 16, verse 69. And then eat of all manner of fruit, and follow humbly the paths ordained for thee by thy sustainer. And lo, there issues from within these bees a fluid of many hues, wherein there is health for man. In all this, behold, there is a message indeed for people who think. So many, many different ways of celebrating that beautiful diversity, right? And that's not even all of it. There's even more. Any other thoughts on this verse, on the two verses together, or just the verse, one of them? Should I read it one more time? So this is 30:21 to 22. And among God's wonders is this: God creates for you mates out of your own kind, so that you might incline towards them. And God engenders love and tenderness between you. In this, behold, there are messages indeed for people who think. And among God's wonders is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your tongues and colors. For in this, behold, there are messages indeed for all who are possessed of innate knowledge. And we got Nadia.
There are two things that came to me when you were reading these two together. So it's interesting, when you started reading, you said something about chooses from your own kind. There was a phrase about that. And to me, immediately, my head went to, people are going to say your own kind. When I hear people say your own kind, I often hear that in a racial context. And what I love then about the Quran is it specifies, what do you mean by your own kind? No, it's not talking about people of your tribe or your race or your language. Because then for people who are really thinking about it, you have this beautiful diversity that's specified. So I love that it throws something in there that kind of allows for this prejudice thinking to come up, and then combats it for people who are thinking. So that's one. The second piece, this verse is really reassuring to me when it talks about love and tenderness, specifically followed by being of different colors, languages, things like that. Because I remember one of the things I was hearing around the time when a lot of my friends were getting married was, yes, you can marry someone of a different culture and, inshallah, you'll get along, but there's a specific understanding you have when you marry from within your own culture. You understand the perspective, you understand the nuances, you understand the family structure. So it was almost this, we're not going to tell you not to do it, but it's going to be a lot harder because you have so it was like a roundabout way of saying don't do it. So then to hear the Quran saying that actually having the diversity of culture and languages and races, it produces this love and tenderness, to me that directly combats that that worry that someone might have in their head. So it was very reassuring to me.
Great way of picking up on that, how God knows our psychology and how we think, and God knows how to combat those prejudices and judgments, right? And we also know that just because two people speak the same language or even grow up in the same town or the same references doesn't mean that they can understand each other. And so in some ways, I've always felt like if you are in an intercultural relationship or marriage, you're going to be aware and actively translating your culture and your understanding of everything against the other person's in a way that maybe someone else who's with someone of their own culture might just assume, and mind reading and all of these things that can always end up in conflict and misunderstandings. So great points. All right, thank you guys for coming to yet another Quran discussion. All right, thank you everyone. Assalamu alaikum.